we're heading into our third climate community of practice session. And this is a module that you will absolutely and cannot afford to miss. So we'll be exploring the critical intersection of energy, climate, and water resources, three pillars that are shaping the future of sustainability and climate action in our communities. And today's experts and our guest speakers are two very incredible and exciting women that are championing very, very informative and lucrative resourcing in the energy sector. And I will be introducing them in a minute. But I do hope as we set out that we look in deeply. Our first guest is Barbara Nantongo. She's a Ugandan. And a clean energy advocate, transforming waste into smokeless briquettes and improved cooking solutions. She's going to explore how clean cooking can reduce pressure on forests, improve household health, lower emissions, and create income opportunities for women. Our second guest is Josephine. Josephine is a mechanical engineer and sustainability practitioner working at the intersection of water, energy, and climate resilience. She will share practical insights on solar-powered water systems, resource efficiency, clean energy innovation, and the role of engineering in building resilient communities. So I'd like us to keep our mics muted unless called upon by the guests or the host. Until then, please do keep our mics muted. It's okay, you can show us yourself. You can put your camera on. That's fair. That's all right. But do keep your microphones muted just for the purpose of being in one accord. So yes, I don't know. Let's welcome our first guest. They'll tell us so much more about themselves and what they do, and then they'll take us on through. Josephine, are you with us? Please do take the floor.
Hi, Daniel. Yes, I'm here with you guys. Let me see if my video is working. Because it wasn't. Good. There we are. Hi, everybody. I hope you're well. And I'm very excited to be here and talking to you guys today. I hope you can hear me clearly. Let me know that you can hear me clearly.
Yes, very loud and clear.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I'm quite excited to be having this conversation with you. This is something that I'm quite passionate about, water and renewable energy specifically. Well, energy, but renewable energy to be specific. So we're talking about UN Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals 6, 7, and 13. So 6 is water, 7 is energy, and then you have 13, which is climate. And so I'm very much interested in how water, energy come together to help communities be climate resilient, right? So how are communities empowered to ensure that in the face of accelerated climate shocks, that they're able to withstand that and come out stronger and better at the end of that? And so today we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about water and energy and how climate is affecting all of that, or rather how we can be building systems that are more resilient so that in the face of climate changes, we're able to adapt better as communities and as societies, as businesses, as individuals as well. And this is also picking up from last week. If you remember last week, our founder, Samuel, walked us through what climate is. And so this is supposed to be a natural progression into some of the resources that are affected, that are mostly affected, or that are very critical whenever you have climate action or climate changes that impact communities or societies. And some of these resources are water and energy. And so it's very important for us to have conversations about how we can empower ourselves, how we can empower communities to make sure that they're resilient. And especially now, it's very hard for us to deny the existence of climate change. I don't know if there's anybody here who is a climate denier. I hope not. Because the entire point of these sessions is for us to learn about climate and how to be a bit resilient and, how to be better communities and how to be good to our environment. Because if you're good to our environment, then it's going to be good to us. So I hope nobody here is a climate denier. Climate action or climate change is a thing. And so it's very important for us to have conversations about how we can protect our resources, especially when it comes to water bodies, our sources of water, and also energy. Where are we getting our power from? And how do those two things intersect? So this is going to be the basis of the conversation today. As you have been told, my name is Josephine, and I am a mechanical engineer by training and a water and renewable energy specialist. And I have been in this industry for close to 10 years now. I've been fortunate enough to work across East Africa and for different organizations who are contributing to solutions in water and energy in different capacities. And so I've worked with different kinds of stakeholders, from communities themselves to individuals to businesses to manufacturers to governments, right? And so yeah, I can say that I am speaking from a point of experience as well. So I hope that this is going to be an interactive session. And so let me just jump into it because we don't have a lot of time. So again, when you're jumping into this conversation, you're looking at climate action, you're looking at the energy transition, and also at water resilience. And so these are the three areas that we're going to be exploring today. And so what does it look like for you to have accelerated climate shocks? I almost forgot I have slides. Oh my goodness. I hope I can share my slides. I forgot that I have something that is going to guide us through this conversation. Let me just do that very fast. I hope you can see my slides. Can you see the slides? Can I get a confirmation?
Oh, yes, yes, we can say that.
Okay, great. Yeah. So basically, this is what I've said about we're going to be covering climate action. If you can go ahead and mute your mics because I'm getting a bit of feedback. Thank you. So we're going to be talking about climate action and how that relates to energy and also water as well. So these are very critical resources. And as you're going to be finding out, water is one of the things that is affected most critically by climate change. And so we need to be able to empower communities to be able to handle such situations. And so the way power is set up in East Africa is such that a lot of East African countries are dependent on water, or water is one of the resources that you need for you to be able to generate energy or for you to be able to generate power. So like in Kenya, for instance, you have over 40% of our grid that is supported by hydropower. And hydropower is basically energy that is coming from water. And so what happens is, because of this heavy reliance, when you have climate stresses, you experience when climate stresses like rapid deforestation, poor upstream land management, where what happens is when it rains, that topsoil is washed away or it's washed down, and this eventually causes severe siltation. And siltation is basically when that happens, it goes down into these turbines and into these dams and it chokes them. And so it becomes a bit impossible for you to produce hydropower when that happens. And so already you can see the direct effect of climate action on how we are going to be producing energy, like practical action on the ground, how that can affect sources of power whenever you have climate stresses like deforestation and flash floods and drought and all of that. And so to protect from the energy grid, what happens is you find authorities who are forced to ration or shut down power, which instantly cuts electricity needs. And this electricity is needed for you, like now the connection to water is the electricity is needed for you to pump water, right? Nowadays, we're moving away from hand pumps. If you guys know hand pumps, those are the pumps where they're not motorized pumps. So you can just use your hands for you to pump water from a shallow well. So you have a lot of those installed in rural communities, for instance, in Kenya. And then you also have a situation where instead of a hand pump, you cut out, if you have what is it called? A bucket of water, you cut it out and then you attach a rope and you throw it inside the well. And then you just pull the rope for you to get the water out of the well. So these are some of the rudimentary methods that communities are still using for them to fetch water, but you're moving away from that and we're going into motorized water pumps. And so when you have a motorized water pump, of course, you're going to be needing energy and reliable sources of energy for you to power these motor pumps, for you to be able to get water to the communities. And so what you're talking about is when there's climate stress or when there's all these accelerated shocks due to climate change, you have these sources of energy or these sources of hydropower being affected in a manner that also affects the production and the distribution of water to communities or to industries, okay? So that is one of the ways that climate stresses can possibly affect your sources of energy or your sources of water. And also remember that due to certain climate shocks like, say, droughts, it means that some water tables, for instance, do not have as much water as they should. The water table reduces. That's a problem already by itself. Sometimes when you have flash floods, then it means that water tables are contaminated or water tables are affected. And so you're no longer pumping quality water to communities. And so they end up suffering different kinds of diseases that come out of that. And so a lot of climate shocks have a varied effects on water and water tables. And because of that, you find that because water and energy are connected, of course, that means then that they have an effect on energy and where we're getting our sources of water. So groundwater depletion is a real problem for the reasons that I have mentioned. And sometimes you'll find that, for instance, if you're drilling boreholes, like in Kenya, in Nairobi specifically, boreholes go up to 200 meters, 300 meters, certain areas in Nairobi. So you can imagine that if you're having groundwater that is, or if you're having water that is, or if the groundwater is, the levels are going down, then you can imagine that you need to dig even deeper boreholes. You need to drill even deeper boreholes. And deeper boreholes automatically translate to higher energy cost because this means you're going to be using bigger pumps, and bigger pumps automatically translate to higher energy use. You're going to be needing even more money in terms of the resources for you to be able to mobilize all the resources for you to do the installation. You're going to be needing, you're going to, even the resource, even the drilling process itself is going to be longer. It's going to need more power for you to be able to accomplish it. So the more we reduce the level of groundwater, or the more groundwater levels go lower because of climate change, of course, this is going to look like that in terms of the depletion of groundwater and what that looks like in terms of pumping water and accessibility of water for communities, and also what that means in terms of energy use. And then the other thing is a fossil fuel trap. Okay, so sorry, I keep forgetting. I don't know, I keep forgetting I have slides. Very useless for me to have created them if I wasn't going to use them. But this is basically what we're talking about. So the food security trap is you have droughts that destroy rain-fed crops. And so, of course, this is basically what we're talking about, the different kinds of climate changes that can happen or climate effects that can occur. We're talking about droughts, we're talking about deforestation, we're talking about flash floods, all of that. So all of this eventually leads to the destruction of crops that rely on rain or consistent rain for them to grow. And then what this happens is it forces people to turn to sources of energy or sources of power that are not the best for the environment, or sources of power that have very high emissions. And when you're talking about climate change, or climate action, what you really want to look out for is your sources of power and whether or not, or how high of emissions they're contributing to the environment. So the lower those emissions are, the better. In fact, if you can keep them at zero, the better. And this is why we are seeing ourselves moving a lot towards renewable sources of energy. So we don't want to be reliant on fossil fuel, such as burning coal, which is something that happens, especially at household levels in communities and especially underserved communities. You find they're very reliant on things like kerosene lamps, reliant on GCOs. GCOs are basically when they use charcoal for them to cook. And so a lot of the times, these are sources of energy that have very high emissions. And so we're trying to move away from fossil fuels and adopt renewable sources of energy, because most of the time, renewable energy sources do not have emissions. And so that is what that looks like. We can see that climate change is an accelerator, and water is the first place that is affected. And sometimes our efforts to fight these water shortages increase the carbon footprint. So instead of reducing the emissions, unfortunately, some of our efforts do the opposite. They increase the emissions that we're trying to fight. We have some myths that are associated with water when it comes to climate realities. Some people believe that water scarcity only means drying up of taps, right, and empty riverbeds. But sometimes that the reality on the ground is scarcity is often about quality. So you remember the example I gave you. When there's flash floods, for instance, and water is rushing into every corner of the world, if I can put it like that. When that happens, then you get sources, water tables being affected by these flash floods. And you find all kinds of contaminants coming into the water sources. And again, you can find situations where the water is not good for consumption and the communities are affected in one way or the other. And then another myth is that water issues are local problems that can be solved entirely within a community. So for instance, Uganda assumes that its water problems are uniquely Uganda's, and so Uganda needs to come up with only Ugandan solutions for its water problems. No, sometimes we need to come together, especially as a region, we need to come together. And especially when you have a region that shares water tables. We know about Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is between Kenya and Uganda. And you get, or rather that's at our water tables that's shared by different communities. And so when that is the case, then of course the solutions that you're coming up with, they need to be shared, right? Because you're affected by this problem as a community, not just as a country, as an individual country. So we need to come together and come up with regional solutions for some of these water and energy problems. And then another myth that we can find is that simply installing more standard plastic tanks and pipes will permanently solve water access. So this is similar to, for instance, it's like me in my line of work, because basically what I do is I deal with water pumps. So I'll go somewhere and assess the water needs and figure out, for instance, if we drill a borehole, my work is to come in and figure out what is the depth of that borehole and what kind of a pump are we going to be designing for that borehole. And then I'm going to, of course, design the system, mobilize the resources, mobilize a team, and then send that team out to ground for them to do the installation. And so sometimes it's simply not enough for you to go and do the installation and then leave the ground, Sometimes you need to actually design systems that are beyond the installation stage, systems that will, again, adapt to climate shocks. So you have to have systems that are adapted to climate shocks. And sometimes, especially us as engineers, the problem is we only focus on providing the technical solution. And we forget that we need to, for instance, empower the community for which we are designing these solutions. Like we need to train the communities to manage or to maintain the system. It's not enough for you to just go to the ground and install a water pumping system or a water treatment system and then leave the ground. And the community doesn't know the first thing about the water treatment system. They don't know anything about repairs. They don't know anything about maintenance. It's not enough. That is not sufficient. So sometimes as engineers, we forget that and we just provide the technical solution and we forget about all these other kinds of empowerment. So I guess that's where we go short, and that's part of the contribution to systems that are not sustainable. So you'll find a lot of the times when that happens, those systems fail within the first 1 or 2 years, and that's something that we're really trying to avoid. So when it comes to the energy, you find that a lot of households in East Africa depend on wood or fuel, right? Wood, fuel, or charcoal. And this is what I was talking about earlier on. And this, of course, means that they need to cut down trees for them to get the charcoal or for them to get the wood. And thus this of course leads to a loss of the carbon sinks. Trees are really, really good for basically just getting that carbon out of the atmosphere. And so when you cut down trees, then it makes it harder for us to reduce those carbon levels in the atmosphere. So dependency on charcoal and fuel is something that we need to move away from. And this is why we're introducing solutions such as briquettes. And this is something that Barbara, the next guest, is going to be talking about a bit into, because this is what she does. And then something that's tied to that is now the household air pollution, right? If you're using charcoal, you're using fuel, you can see that it's a very smoky, very sooty kind of an energy source. And so, of course, that means there's a lot of in-house pollution. And that's definitely not good for the children in the household, the women who are the ones cooking a lot of the times. A lot of the times in the long run, that is not good for them. And then, unfortunately, much as a lot of East Africa is powered by renewable energy sources, we still have a majority of the population that does not yet have access to grid energy or to grid source or to grid power. So a lot of people don't still have access to electricity. They have not yet been reached. And these are the kinds of communities, these are the communities we call underserved communities. And we're having a lot of organizations now that are coming up to provide solutions for these underserved communities. And the solutions, of course, are looking to adopt renewable sources of energy. And a lot of the times, the renewable source of energy is solar energy. And the reason it's solar is because solar is actually quite accessible to households, right, in East Africa. Other sources of renewable energy are not as easily accessible to households. And so this is why you'll find that solar has penetrated a lot of households, and it's a solution that is being proposed for underserved communities. So just to keep it short when it comes to that. And then the energy and the water connection. What is that connection? What does that look like? So you need energy for you to produce water. Again, the example I gave you about if you have installed a water pumping system, it's most likely a motorized pump, and a motorized pump requires electricity. So you need a source of electricity for you to use the pump and for you to get the water. So if you don't have that source of electricity, it means the water treatment or the water pumping system you have is useless, because you're not going to be able to use it. You're not going to be able to get water out of it. And then consequently, you also need water for you to produce energy. For instance, the hydropower example I gave you, and East Africa is dependent on hydropower. So if you don't have water, then a lot of the cases, then you're going to be having shortages in the generation of electricity. So that is the how water and energy rely on each other. So you can see that it's impossible for you to have a conversation about energy without talking about water. And it's possible for you to have a conversation about water without talking about energy. So if we waste water, we are also wasting the energy. And if we lose the energy, we do not have access to the water. And so every time you're talking about those two, they're very much interconnected. And so some of the practical solutions that we are proposing on ground is solar-powered water pumps, for instance, right? So instead of providing solutions that are heavily dependent on the grid, we want to also bring solutions that can be coupled to solar power as a source of energy. So, and that's why we're seeing a lot of, let me show you, a lot of solar installations. I'm sure you guys have seen this happening around your communities. Like in this instance here, we have a solar panel installation for pumping water. So this is a very neat setup. So this is what that would look like in on ground. And then also this person here on this other side, they're using this for powering their household. So you can use solar not just for pumping water, but also for powering your household. But the point is, we are moving towards the adoption of solar because it's reliable. It has zero emissions, right? And it's also quite easy for you to maintain in the long run, because once the installation has been done and the community has been trained on the basics, it will basically run itself. And solar panels have a very long warranty period. So you're talking about 15 to 20 years of warranty. And this is how long you expect to get service from these panels. And so this is something that we're proposing a lot, solar-powered water pumps using the sun, a renewable source of energy. It's not going to go anywhere. So we better use it as much as possible for us to get energy out of it. And then whenever possible, making sure that we collect rainwater, right? So installing or rather building homes that are adapted to the collection of rainwater. So you're building better gutter systems, you're coming up with better ways of storing water or collecting the water, whether it's through underground tanks or you're having overhead tanks, or you're having just plastic tanks that can be placed just outside of the house for you to be able to collect rainwater. That would be also a really good way of ensuring that we're taking care of our water availability. And then, of course, what we mentioned about moving away from high emissions sources of cooking fuel, like charcoal, to something a bit more better, something that doesn't have as high emissions, such as briquettes, mekos. Nowadays, we're seeing that there are sources of energy or ways of cooking that reduce emissions by up to 50%. So let's really look at how can we transform, or how can we adopt a circular economist kind of a mindset, where instead of throwing away waste, for instance, agricultural waste, how can we convert that to briquettes? And then how can we use those briquettes to cook at the household level? So there's a lot that we can do in terms of adopting practical solutions on ground. And what that would look like is, the first step is resource mapping, right? Sit down with communities and find out what the exact nature of the problem is, and find out where is the water wasted, where is the energy lost. Find out and design the solutions together with the communities. And then low-cost innovation. So whenever possible, have accessibility, or when you have access to low-tech solutions, then that would be a really good thing, right? And then behavioral advocacy, shifting community mindsets. Whenever possible, have conversations with people about, for instance, how they can recycle agricultural waste, right? How to use water better, how to manage water better, how to reduce waste at the household level, how to prevent contamination, how to prevent contamination of water sources, all of that. These kinds of conversations, these kinds of trainings, these kinds of mentorship sessions is one of the ways to help us build or shift these community mindsets. And so these are some of the ways, these are some of the things that you can do with solar. I talked about pumping water, like in that case, in this first case. And then you can also power your household with solar. And then you can also use solar for irrigation. Like in this case here, this person, what you see here, this is a solar pump. This is a standalone solar pump, and it comes complete with the hose. So you can see that is the hose, and it also comes complete with its own panels. So you just carry it, and then you place it in your farm, and then you pump the water. You can see the water coming up on that other end. And then once you're done for the day, you pack it up and you go back home with it. So it's a very neat solution. And it's one of the solutions that you can propose to communities, and especially communities that do not have as much access to funds. This is a relatively affordable solution for that, for irrigation purposes. And then this is also another setup, but slightly bigger. So this is not as compact as this design here. This one here requires you to install several panels, right? And so of course you have to install a structure to support the panels. Irrigation system through drip irrigation. So it's a very neat setup as well. And then other ways you can use solar, these are called swimming pool panels, right? So these ones are for swimming pools. If you have a swimming pool and you're wondering how you can heat it up, you can install solar panels. And then you also have solar water heating for households. Instead of you installing solar equipment for household heating, you can do a separate, or there's systems designed specifically for heating the water in the household. And that is what they look like. And then, of course, for lighting, especially for security, right? You can buy flashlights that are powered by solar. So solar can do a lot, and solar is easily accessible. Governments are working hard to ensure that solar is also quite affordable to people. And so even as we move to making other sources of renewable energy accessible to other people, accessible at the household level or at the community level, solar is here, and we need to figure out a way to use it as much as possible to create systems that are climate resilient. At the end of the day, remember that the goal is to ensure that communities are more resilient in the face of climate